On the 7th of May of the year 2000, Vladimir Putin took office as president-elect of Russia for the first time. He won the election in the first round with almost 53% of the vote. Putin entered his first term as a liberal and as a democratic politician, who is going to continue Yeltsin's course. At the inauguration ceremony, Yeltsin stood behind his successor as if looking out for him as a younger comrade. However, from the very first months of Putin's presidency, there were already warning signs of the return of censorship, political repression, and the gradual dismantling of civil liberties in Russia. Even the 2000 election itself was markedly falsified, which was a first for the new democratic Russia. Mathematician Sergei Shupilkin, who specializes in elections, estimates that about 3 million votes were added to Putin's result. Today we are going to talk about how President Vladimir Putin's first term was. It was an unusual time, at the same time as the liberal reforms began to tighten the screws within the political life of the country. This period combined rapid economic growth with an attack on free media. It was a time of successful counter-terrorism in Russia and at the same time of a major terrorist attack at Nordost. So, first things first. The main event against which Putin came to power was the Second Chechen War. The previous war ended with the defeat of the federal forces and the signing of the Khasavjurd Accords in August 1996. After that, the terrorists and the supporters of radical Islam, the Wahhabis, seized power in Chechnya. After Russia showed weakness and was left to their own devices, they started to strengthen their positions and prepare terrorist acts in other regions of the country. The elected president of Chechnya, Aslan Maskhadov, wasn't in a position to cope with scattered bandit formations. Kidnappings of the people began to take place on mass scale. For example, in March 1999, senior Russian general Gennady Shpigun was abducted and later killed. The Wahhabis began to conduct raids and assaults on the troops and police checkpoints both within the republic and in other regions of the country. On the 7th of August 1999, several hundred fighters under the command of Basayev and Khattab invaded the neighboring region of Dagestan. Within a few days, they managed to advance 10 kilometers deep into the region, captured small villages and settlements. They announced the introduction of Sharia laws and even managed to broadcast an Islamic television channel. It's believed that Sergei Stepashin's lukewarm reaction to these events led to his resignation and the appointment of Vladimir Putin as a prime minister in 1999. Stepashin then said that Russia could lose Dagestan.
Здравствуйте. Садиться не буду. Чтобы не засидеться, да, Николай Емельянович? Очень тяжелая обстановка сегодня в Дагестане и на Кавказе. Я только что прибыл оттуда. Пожалуй, мы можем действительно потерять Дагестан. Ну, а теперь о текущем. Утром я был у президента. Он подписал указ о моей отставке. Благодарил за хорошую работу. И отправил в отставку. Исполняющим обязанности назначен Владимир Владимирович Путин, секретарь Совета Безопасности, директор ФСБ.
Putin, in contrast, was resolute and began active combat operations against the gangster formations of Basayev and Khattab. Shortly after the fighting began, terrorists began blowing up entire apartment buildings in Moscow and other Russian cities, killing more than 300 civilians. There are many rumors and conspiracy theories surrounding these terrorist attacks. But in this case, the official version of the authorities is likely to be truth, and the accusation of the bombing by the FSB isn't tenable. The Wahhabis, led by Khattab and Abu Umar, planned and carried out these terrible attacks. All this led to an increase in radical sentiments in society. For Russians, the topic of Chechnya, especially after the defeat, was very painful. But now that troops have been reintroduced into Chechnya and the war has reached literally every apartment building, the opinions of Russians perfectly coincided with Putin's policy and his harsh statements regarding terrorists. By the end of September, the terrorists had been driven out of Dagestan and the federal troops had re-entered Chechnya. The Second Chechen War, unlike the first, wasn't at all like the War for Independence, which the Chechens had de facto had for 3 years. This time the war was needed because of the expansion of radical Islamists into other regions of Russia, accompanied by hostage-taking, bombings, killings and civilian casualties. Everywhere the Wahhabis came, settlements plunged into medieval times. The actions of the federal troops were much more welcomed in contrast to the first Chechen campaign. Largely because of this loyal attitude in society, the second campaign is considered significantly more successful than the first, although it lasted longer and was also very bloody. According to the official data, during the counter-terrorist operation, which lasted from 1999 to 2000, nearly 7,500 servicemen were killed. At the end of the first campaign, more than 5,500 Russian soldiers were killed. The Russian command made important conclusions after the first unsuccessful campaign, and many operations were planned more thoroughly and executed much better. By the end of December, the federal troops had blockaded Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. Harsh memories of the failed storming of Grozny and the colossal losses on New Year's Eve in 1994 forced the federal troops to abandon any new adventure solutions. Tanks were no longer brought into the city. It was taken under siege, and the formidable city was systematically destroyed by artillery for almost 2 months. Shelling by artillery practically razed the city to the ground. In 2003, the United Nations named it the most destroyed city in the world. One way or another, by early February 2000, Grozny had passed into the hands of the federal forces, and in the spring, the active combat phase ended all over Chechnya. The terrorists turned to guerrilla warfare similar to that of the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland. Their struggle continued for many more years. Manifestations of this war are the terrorist attacks in Russian cities, including the horrific hostage-taking dramas in Nordost and Beslan city. An important development of the Second Chechen War was the reliance on allies within Chechnya itself. The federals were supported by the chief mufti, head of Muslims, Ahmad Kadyrov, who during the First War opposed the Russian troops. During the interwar period, he became an opponent of the Wahhabis, was the opposition to the Chechen authorities, and began cooperating with the federal government. Eventually, Putin appointed him head of the Chechen administration at the end of hostilities. Kadyrov and his supporters gradually began taking control of Chechen territory with their own forces and armed units supported by federal troops. On the 9th of May 2004, Ahmad Kadyrov was assassinated. The rostrum on which he was receiving the parade was blown up. Later, his son Ramzan Kadyrov became the head of Chechnya. Now for the economics. Putin, when he became the prime minister in 1999, retained almost the entire Stepashin's government. It was a liberal government created by Stepashin as Yeltsin's likely successor to continue the first president's course of changing the economy toward a market economy. Mikhail Kasyanov, an experienced economist who had worked with the first democratic government of the early 90s, became the head of the government in May 2000. Kasyanov was then Russia's chief negotiator with Western creditors, the International Monetary Fund, the Paris Club and the London Club. Thanks to him, Russia was able to negotiate the restructuring of Soviet debts as well as the issuance of new loans, which certainly helped to improve the economy of the country, the financial system, to stabilize the ruble exchange rate. This contributed to the beginning of economic growth in the early 2000s. In 1999, Kasyanov became Minister of Finance of Russia and was able to achieve, for the first time in the history of the country, a budget surplus. Wage and pension arrears were the thing of the past. But his main achievement was tax reform. It was then that a flat tax scale with a rate of 13% appeared in Russia. Before that, the system of tax calculations had been complicated and non-transparent. He reduced the value-added tax and the unified social tax. For small and medium-sized businesses, Kasyanov introduced a simplified taxation system. Thanks to these measures, the tax collection rate increased several times. A significant part of the businesses came out of the shadows because it became easier and more profitable to pay taxes than to try to avoid them. Kasyanov established full-fledged land ownership, something that had never happened in the Soviet Union or Russia in its entire history. He launched the transfer of agricultural land to the private hands, which immediately improved the situation in the agriculture sector, and there was an explosive growth of agricultural products. Let me remind you that food shortages were the Achilles heel for the Soviet leadership, and this eventually led to its resolution. Russia returned to the world grain market as an exporter for the first time in 100 years. It was an incredible economic victory. The Kasyanov government introduced bank deposit insurance, protected depositors from unreliable banks, and carried out large-scale pension reform, switching from the distributive Soviet system to a saving system. This is a tremendous improvement in the lives of millions of Russian people. Looking ahead, we should note that the pension reform initiated by Kasyanov was later scrapped by Putin, and all the money accumulated by citizens was frozen, in fact taken away. No one in Russia, unfortunately, understands this yet. The economic growth has been impressive. Already in 2000, GDP growth was 10%. Few economies in the world can show such a result in 1 year. In the following years, the growth slowed down a little, but was still about 5 to 7% per year. This rapid economic growth lasted until 2008. Then, a very different era began, the era of stagnation. My country is still in it. The level of GDP per person in 2022 is still at the level of 2008. Important note, such an impressive result was achieved at the level of rather low oil prices. The price per barrel fluctuated between $25 and $30, several times lower than Putin's later years. In the end, the Kasyanov government was very successful and raised Putin rating to the sky. Surprisingly, in February 2004, for no apparent reason, Vladimir Putin dismissed Mikhail Kasyanov. Events unfolded according to the following scenario. Kasyanov wasn't Putin's man, but rather was imposed on him by the previous presidential administration. It's very likely that Putin's closest aide, Igor Chechen, really wanted to get into the government for the prime minister's chair, and with the help of his friends in FSB organized an operation to get Mikhail Kasyanov out of his way. For the New Year vacations, the head of the government flew to Austria for the sky vacation. While Kasyanov was skating, new reports were being placed on Putin's desk. They indicated that Kasyanov was the key figure in the plot to overthrow Putin, the details of which he was discussing with Austrian Chancellor Schlusser. The gist of the plot is as follows. Presidential elections are due to take place in March 2004, but they can be thwarted if the turnout is less than 50%. How can they be thwarted? Convince all the candidates to withdraw their candidacies. The future course of events is obvious. The new round of elections is scheduled for June, while Putin's term in office expires on May. This means that Prime Minister Kasyanov will become acting president under the constitution. He will have all the power in his hands before the elections. Kasyanov had no idea such experience existed, while the anti-conspiracy efforts of the presidential administration were already in full swing. When Kasyanov came back from vacation, it took him some time to realize what had happened. He recalls that on February 23, Putin behaved very strangely. He didn't talk to anyone, but in the corner he was whispering about something with FSB director Nikolai Patrushev. The next day, Putin summoned Kasyanov to the Kremlin and announced that he had decided to exercise his constitutional right to decide to dismiss Prime Minister. Then Putin told Kasyanov that he knew about all the conspiracy. Kasyanov expressed genuine surprise, after which Putin even offered to the former premier the position of Secretary of the Security Council, but Kasyanov declined. Defeating Kasyanov and keeping him out of power was a psychotherapeutic struggle with Vladimir Putin's next major fear, a reminder of his main defeat, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the desire to prevent its repetition in Russia, and to prevent Mikhail Kasyanov from becoming Viktor Yushchenko. He was president of Ukraine at that time and didn't let the pro-Kremlin candidate Viktor Yanukovych win. For most of Putin's term in office, Ukraine will be the most painful and lively topic for him. But we will talk about this in the third part of our program. By the end of his first term, Putin had finally abandoned the course of liberal reforms, and it was then that he began to build an autocratic regime. On the 12th of August 2000, at 11 o'clock in the morning, during an exercise in the Barents Sea, the nuclear submarine Kursk crashed. While preparing to launch torpedoes, two explosions occurred in one of the compartments, one of which was so powerful that it was recorded by seismologists on the Norwegian side. The explosions destroyed the bow of the entire boat. 95 submariners died in the first minutes of tragedy, but 23 submariners who were in the tail managed to survive. They blocked off the last ninth compartment as instructed and began to await their rescue. They were confident that they would soon be rescued by sounding Morse code signals. Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov writes a note in complete darkness listing the names of the surviving crew members and telling them there was a little chance of survival, but they would try to save themselves. However, despite the incomprehensible and violent explosions, the failure of Kursk to fulfill the exercise tasks and a lack of the communication with the submarine cruiser, no attempts were made to find out what had happened until the evening. After the accident, Admiral Popov, commander of Northern Fleet, said at a press conference that the exercises were going smoothly and all tasks had been completed. Only at 11 o'clock in the morning, the day after the accident, the submarine Kursk was declared wrecked and the rescue operation was launched. It wasn't until the next morning that rescuers reached the alleged crash site. The news began to report that there were survivors in the sunken submarine who were signaling Mayday, and with them allegedly established communication. Later, the signals that the sailors were signaling with heavy object hitting the hull of the boat would be renamed technical noise. This version will be given to convince the Russians that all the sailors died instantly. Over the next few days, rescuers would try to dock the hatch of the ninth compartment, but nothing worked. The reasons for the failures were storm, poor visibility, and large roll of the submarine. But none of this was true. The problem was the Kursk's design flaws and the Northern Fleet's lack of suitable salvage equipment. This, of course, wasn't voiced publicly in the days of disaster. Moreover, when Western countries like Norway, seeing the unofficial actions of Russia, offered their help, Russia declined. Only on the 19th of August, a week after the crash, after all the Russian rescue equipment had failed, they did accept Norway's help. In less than a day, the Norwegian submariners were able to open the ninth compartment and found it completely flooded. All the sailors in it were dead. The whole country watched the crash of the Kursk literally live on TV, hoping to the last for the crew members' salvation. Even then it was clear that the official version was a lie. Putin, speaking to the wives and mothers of the dead sailors, and the next day in an address to Russians on TV repeated this lie. He said that the rescue operation began immediately, not a day after the accident, that the Navy had all the necessary means of rescue, and when it was needed, Norwegian help was immediately accepted. But with all the efforts, the sailors could no longer be saved. Putin's behavior in the days of the crash and immediately afterwards was as strange as possible. He didn't even interrupt his vacation and only flew to Moscow on the 17th of August. When American journalist Larry King asked what happened to the Kursk submarine,
"You tell me, what happened with the submarine?"
Она утонула.
Putin smilingly replied, "It sank." The Kursk catastrophe was the president's first serious test and he didn't pass it. All his worst qualities are embedded in this misfortune. The most important consequence of the Kursk sinking was Putin's attack on media. The result of this attack is the elimination of freedom of speech in Russia. On the 2nd of September 2000, Sergei Dorenko, the journalist who sunk the prosecutor general and harshly criticized the mayor of Moscow, aired his program. The entire program was devoted to the Kursk disaster. He harshly criticized Putin. Interviews with relatives of the dead sailors were shown and all the lies of the official version of this tragedy was argued. Especially striking were the terrible conditions in which the Russian naval officers and sailors were forced to live. This issue is on YouTube. You can watch it as a quality journalistic work in a free country in a crisis situation should look like. In Russia, everyone is used to the fact that television is only propaganda. But as recently as 20 years ago, words of criticism of President were freely heard on the air of the country's main TV channel. After this broadcast, Putin was furious. According to Sergei Dorenko, Putin called Channel 1's owner Boris Berezovsky and had a tough conversation with him. Dorenko was immediately fired and his program was shut down despite his huge ratings. The relationship with Berezovsky also ended. As early as January 2001, he sold his shareholding to Roman Abramovich, another Russian oligarch, and after that fled to London to escape criminal prosecution. Abramovich later transferred shares to the pro-Kremlin bank VTB and the National Media Group, where the chairman of the board of directors was Alina Kabaeva. Many believed that she is Putin's mistress. Thus, the first channel became the propaganda mouthpiece for the state. A similar fate awaited the most popular independent and liberal NTV channel. The oligarch Vladimir Gusinsky owned the Media Most Group, which included the radio station Echo Moskvy, the NTV channel, the newspaper Itogi, and other publications of less importance to Russians. 30% of Media Most have been owned by the state-owned company Gazprom Media since the middle of 19th. After Putin came to power, Gazprom Media launched an operation to seize the assets of Vladimir Gusinsky. He cited NTV's alleged debt to Gazprom as the reason. In June 2000, Gusinsky had already received a hint that NTV would have to be given to the state. At the time, he was accused of fraud and sent to prison for 3 days. Upon his release, Gusinsky left Russia immediately, never to return. In the fall of that same year, the attack continued. A series of criminal cases were opened against Media Most executives. Journalists from NTV channel were summoned for questioning. The entire journalist community raised a big fuss about the criminal cases against journalists. The group of NTV journalists managed to agree a meeting with Vladimir Putin in the winter of 2001. The channel's editor-in-chief, Evgeny Kiselyov, attended the meeting. According to one of the journalists, during a closed-door meeting, the journalists were presented with the following conditions for NTV's preservation: to refrain from investigating corruption cases, change the coverage and opinions about the war in Chechnya, and remove Putin's character from the program Puppets, a very popular comedy program about politics. Officially, Putin has stated that he is, of course, powerless. This is a dispute between two companies and the state cannot interfere in it. This wording would be used many times later. The public campaign to protect NTV from being crushed was very high profile and large scale. In April 2001, shareholders' meeting was held to elect new board of directors. Alfred Koch was appointed chairman, Boris Jordan, a Russian-born American, was appointed general director, and Vladimir Kulistikov, head of the state news agency RIA Novosti, became an editor-in-chief. The struggle between journalists and new management continued for several more days. On April 14, the NTV newsroom was seized by force. Gazprom Media replaced the guards and revoked the passes of undesirable employees. After that, they shut down some of the programs that the government didn't like, Itogi and Independent Investigation. Almost all of the journalists who were phased off the channel left for TV6 channel, but they were soon forced out of there as well. The next step in the free speech purge was to rid the channel of Boris Jordan's team. This happened in the year 2002, when Putin was unhappy with NTV's coverage of the Nordost hostage situation. This led to a real censorship, unlike anything that existed only in Soviet times. Programs were shut down, journalists were taken off the air, and journalists were fired for taking positions that differed from those of the authorities. In 1994, the channel went from news to propaganda and slid down to endless series about gangsters. On October 23, in the Dubrovka theater during the musical Nordost, men in military uniforms and masks with automatic weapons burst onto the stage. They quickly and professionally mined the hall, killing 2 theater employees and taking about 1,000 spectators hostage. The terrorists are headed by Mafsar Barayev, and among his fighters almost half of them are women, shahids. In Russia in the 90s, there were also hostage takings, the best known of which was the occupation of the hospital in the town of Budenovsk. But back then terrorist attacks occurred in the regions close to Chechnya, and no one expected something like this to happen in the heart of Moscow. The Russians were in for a real shock. Once again, no one felt safe. The terrorists were well prepared. They had brought weapons and explosives to Moscow in advance, selected a convenient room for the seizure, and planned for the operation precisely in time. This is a monstrous failure of the special services, either incompetence or, even worse, corruption. Negotiations with the terrorists continued for 2 days. Their main demand was the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya. They wanted to communicate only with significant Russian politicians and cultural figures of their own choosing. Among others, the fighters demanded Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov for talks, but the FSB didn't let him in, they said for security reasons. At 5 in the morning of October 2006, the storming of the building begins. A sleeping gas, the formula of which is still state secret, begins to be administered in the auditorium. Special operations soldiers burst into the building and killed the terrorists. An hour and a half later, the operation to eliminate the militancy is completed. SWAT fighters begin evacuating the hostages poisoned by the sleeping gas fumes. Dozens of hostages are being taken out and deposited directly on the pavement near the entrance to the building. The operation of rescue the victims is monstrously badly organized. Clearly, not enough ambulances are needed, so people are loaded onto ordinary buses without regaining consciousness and sent off to hospital in Moscow. All this fuss wastes too much time. The doctors who received the victims are not aware of the gas used. They weren't told about it by authorities, so the doctors don't know what kind of antidote to use. Many will die without regaining consciousness or receiving any help. Many will die before reaching the hospital. Many will die right on the stairs in front of the theater, choking on their tongue. They simply couldn't be stuck on the ground like logs and not given first aid. 130 people were killed in the attack. Only 5 of them were killed by the terrorists, and the rest were killed during the assault. This story fully demonstrated the Putin government's true attitude towards the lives of ordinary Russians. The hostage rescue operation was deemed a success. The FSB generals received their awards, but the dead and injured hostages were simply forgotten about. They were given a dash in the course of death column. A full investigation of the rescue operation was banned. No one held responsible. Relatives of the victims tried to sue the state, but all their claims were rejected by the Russian courts. Only through the European Court of Human Rights, some managed to obtain compensation from the Russian authorities. Looking ahead, Russia withdrew from the Council of Europe, and now no Russian can receive protection from the European Court. In an interview, Putin said that he personally gave the order to begin the assault, knew about the possible consequences, and doesn't think that anything was done wrong. The only people to whom claims were made by NTV journalists. One of Putin's important actions at the beginning of his first presidential term was the equal removal of the oligarchs. This was presented to the Russians in such a way that before they were oligarchs who had stolen half the country and influenced the government, but now a strong president would punish them all. Berezovsky and Gusinsky were forced out of the country, and the head of the largest private bank, Alpha Bank, Mikhail Friedman, is being searched in his office and home. Criminal charges have been brought against Vagit Likperov, president of the Lukoil company. All of this forced all big businesses to swear allegiance to Putin in order to preserve their freedom and their businesses. However, in February 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the head of the largest private oil company YUKOS, disloyalty was shown. He accused the state-owned company Rosneft of dishonesty and corruption, which had purchased a private small asset at an obviously inflated price. Putin didn't like this very much and responded by attacking YUKOS himself, accusing the corporation of failing to pay taxes. This confrontation gave rise to the YUKOS case. First, the tax service conducts an additional audit and finds a mass of violations, amounting to almost $25 billion, which significantly exceeds all of the company's revenues. That taxes were demanded more than the company had received from the sale of oil. In the early 2000s, YUKOS became the largest oil company in the country and conducted its IPO, listed its shares on the London Stock Exchange, and was seen as an example of transparent and honest business. Mikhail Khodorkovsky initiated a project to merge with another oil company, Sibneft, and create a merged corporation with ExxonMobil. Khodorkovsky didn't consider these plans to be coordinated with the Kremlin, which didn't suit Putin. But the main reason for the attack on YUKOS was Khodorkovsky's public activities. He began funding opposition parties in Russia, as well as organizations like Open Russia and the School of Public Policy, which educated the younger generation and trained new politicians in Russia. All of this worked without the Kremlin sanctions, which in an authoritarian Russia had already become unacceptable. Political analyst Stanislav Belkovsky published a report in which he said that Khodorkovsky had plans to reform Russia into a parliamentary republic with a significant role for the parliament and the prime minister. In Putin's opinion, this is a monstrous crime, which he equated to high treason and a possible coup in the country. Khodorkovsky, as was customary, was given several signals. On June 19, 2003, Alexei Pichugin, the head of YUKOS security service, was detained and accused of kidnapping and murder. He would later be sentenced to life imprisonment, and he is still in prison. On the 2nd of July, Khodorkovsky's closest associate and partner Platon Lebedev was arrested. Khodorkovsky didn't take these signals and didn't go abroad, although he had the opportunity to do so. On the contrary, he continued to travel around the country, meeting with governors and presenting scholarships and grants to students and young scientists. It was something reminiscent of future election campaign. On October 25, Khodorkovsky was arrested at Novosibirsk airport. In 2005, the court sentenced him to 9 years in prison. Later, the ex-head of YUKOS would be tried again. In 2010, he would be accused of stealing all the oil, 350 million tons, from his own company. The second YUKOS case looked completely absurd, which didn't prevent the judge from giving Khodorkovsky and Lebedev another 14 years in prison. Khodorkovsky was released in 2013. Putin unexpectedly signed a decree pardoning him. A month later, Platon Lebedev was also released. It seems that this was done to improve Russia's image in connection with the Winter Olympics in the city of Sochi in Russia. Michael Khodorkovsky now lives in London and engaged in public activities, continuing to fund Open Russia, which has been recognized as a foreign agent and is not desirable in Russia. And against its members there are regular administrative and criminal proceedings. YUKOS main asset Lugansk-Neftegas was sold at auction in the 2004. The buyer was a front company, Baikal Finance Group, with an authorized capital of $150. Soon, this company was bought out by the giant Rosneft. Thus, the largest private oil company has passed into the hands of the state. This is called nationalization in Russian. Igor Chechen, Putin's former secretary at St. Petersburg mayor's office, who was thought to be the author of the attack on Mikhail Khodorkovsky, became the president of Rosneft. The removal of the oligarchs actually turned out to be a replacement of the old oligarch businessmen by the new oligarchs of the corrupt officials. Another phrase that characterizes Putin during his first presidential term is strengthening the vertical of power. This means strengthening federal power in regions by taking their own budgets away from regional authorities, and all governors will be subordinated to new officials. In May of 2000s, federal districts are created, which unite several regions and subordinate their governors, who are now under federal supervision and cannot conduct independent policies within their own region without coordinating with the federal center. In August 2000, the Federal Council, the upper house of parliament, was reformed. Previously, its members were regional leaders, governors. In this way, the regions could influence the federal government through the parliament. Now there is no such balance of power anymore. Instead of regional heads, special representatives of the United Russia Party are appointed there. To compensate, a new body called the State Council is being created, where governors come several times a year to listen to the president's speech. Of course, the State Council has no real power. In 2001, the reform of the budget began. Its main result was a complete centralization of finances. Now the federal center is the main distributor of the budget, which dramatically increased the dependence of the regions and their governance from Moscow. Political parties are also being integrated into the vertical of power. After Unity and Fatherland merged, the largest party is formed. The ruling party is now United Russia. Opposition parties are hooked on the needle of the budget funding, making them completely controllable. Parliament becomes obedient to the president and its speaker, Boris Gryzlov, says what has become legendary in Russia: Parliament is no place for discussion. Great. The completion of the establishment of the vertical of power was the abolition of gubernatorial elections. They began to be appointed by the federal center. Before that, on the 1st of September 2004, there was a terrible terrorist attack in the city of Beslan. Chechen fighters and Arab mercenaries took the school children hostage. More than 300 people, mostly children, were killed in the attack. Putin, with his usual cynicism, used this tragedy to strengthen the federal center and cancelled the gubernatorial elections under the pretext of fighting terrorism. During Putin's first term, Russia's political system was seriously altered. The presidential administration subjugated the executive, legislative and judicial branches, becoming a reincarnation of the communists. Everything is now decided only in the presidential administration. Even the smallest issue is decided by one person. The most important task for Putin was to ensure the irremovability of power. Those who didn't want to fit into this new authoritarian model moved to the non-systemic opposition, which Putin will fight all the way to the beginning of the war with Ukraine. In Putin's first term, one can clearly see how nepotism and favoritism are manifested. Putin's friends, his judo partners and former colleagues from the KGB and St. Petersburg City Hall took key positions in the country and hold them to this day, regardless of their effectiveness. In Russia, it's become a popular expression. We don't fire people for inefficiency, we fire them for disloyalty. The Rotenberg brothers and Yuri Kovalchuk, friends of Putin's youth, have become the richest men in Russia. No one really knows their real money, and according to some estimates, they may be the richest people in the world, just like Putin himself. The destruction of the free media, the rollback of liberal reforms and repression of political rivals, all these trends will be multiplied in the future during Putin's second term as president, which we'll talk about next time.